This is the One Soldier Podcast, episode 25, with me, Russell Hillier. You wake up, you get a shower, you drink your coffee, you start scrolling through your social media feed, and that's when things get weird. There's these posts and activity that 1,000 American veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have landed on the border. They're armed with sophisticated military equipment. They're trained. They've killed. They've come to take Canada hostage. It's come out of nowhere, and you don't believe it. It's not registering. But media websites and the radio, well, they're saying the same thing. It's real. It is happening. And not only that, but there are rumors of more imminent invasion points across the entire country. And you don't know what to do. Would you carry on as normal? Your daily routines? Would you go to work that day? Would you send your kids to school that day? Real questions for a lot of unknowns. And that's the kind of scenario that we're going to be getting into and talking about today. Because if you lived in Canada in 1866 instead of 2021, this is what you would have woken up to. This is what you would have been faced with. On today's podcast, I'm joined by author and historian Christopher Klein to talk about his book, When the Irish Invaded Canada. And it all starts in the year 1866, when Irish veterans of the American Civil War launched a series of raids into Canada with the goal of holding the country hostage in exchange for political freedom in their home country of Ireland. The most notable of these battles occurred at Ridgeway in Ontario, where Canadian forces were routed from the field of battle. Christopher Klein joined me from his home near Boston to talk about his book and the Fenian Invasions. Our conversation starts now. All right, yeah. Love the background. It's an impressive collection.
Yeah, I maybe read one or two of them, I think, too. So half of them are
nicely done.
Half of mine, thanks.
Well, we'll just get started if you're good to go.
Yeah, sure.
Just for the listeners at home, I've got Christopher Klein with me right now, and you're beaming in from America, right?
South of the border. Yep, right outside Boston area.
Okay, awesome. So, Christopher Klein, the reason that I wanted to talk to you today is because you have a relatively recent book about the Fenian invasions of Canada. Actually, one of the first episodes I did on this podcast a couple years ago was with a guy named, an author named Peter Vronsky. Mm-hmm. And I know that you have talked to him because he's in the preface of your book. And of course, he wrote a book about the Battle of Ridgeway. We had a great discussion. And so when I saw that you had your own book, much more recent, I knew I had to get you on the show. So thanks again for making the time.
That's great. Appreciate it.
A lot of Canadians, I don't think, are really aware of what the Fenian invasions are all about. And one of the reasons for that is we don't really teach it in Canada. I mean, I'm a history teacher or a social studies teacher, and the Fenians get about like this much room in the textbook, and it's usually accompanied by that iconic lithograph of the green Fenian line, right, chasing away the routed Canadian forces in their British tunics.
Yep.
And so that's really all we get about the Fenians. In, I guess you could say, mainstream education. But could you give like a little bit of background about who the Fenians were and what they're all about before we get too far down this road?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in Canada, at least, you may get a paragraph. We get absolutely none of it here in the United States. And this was something I had not even heard about until I just stumbled across. I was doing research and talking about someone from that time period who was a veteran of the attack on Canada. And I did a double take, and I was like, what in the world is this? And then sort of delved into the story that gets completely lost here in the United States, because it's right in the aftermath of the Civil War. But the Fenian Raids were carried out by members of a group that was called the Fenian Brotherhood. And their members were mostly refugees from the Great Hunger in Ireland. So these were men living in Ireland, which of course had been under British rule for about 7 centuries at that time. And for 7 centuries, the British were trying to recast the Irish in their own image, unsuccessfully. and the Irish basically had banded together to preserve their language, their customs, their religion. And then when the potato crop failed in 1845, there's Irish who think that the British are trying to exterminate them altogether as well. And a million of them, more than a million of them, are going to end up fleeing to Canada and the United States. And they they never really let go of their love of their homeland, even after living in the United States for a couple decades. Many of these Irish end up fighting in the American Civil War. About 200,000 native-born Irish fight in the American Civil War. It's just a massive number. But then, even after fighting in the Civil War, and many of them wounded in battle, they still had their goal of trying to liberate Ireland. And the goal of the Fenian Brotherhood was that this organization in the United States would, with the freedoms that America provided, be able to raise money, purchase weapons, and cast off British rule in Ireland. And their intention after they formed the organization the whole time was they were going to have a revolution in Ireland that had been tried every generation or so. But when the British cracked down on their sister organization in Ireland, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, in 1865, the plan sort of evolved here among the Fenians in the United States, and they decided that why try to hit the British an ocean away when they could just get on a train and overnight be on British territory in Canada. And that so their intention is invade Canada. Some of the more radical members of the Fenians expected that they would basically just be that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching, like Thomas Jefferson wrote about the War of 1812, and expected that they would get the support of all the Irish in Canada and the French speakers as well. So they thought they'd be able to hold maybe Canada hostage and ransom it for Ireland's independence from the British. But probably the most realistic thing that they're trying to do here is to spark a war between the United States and Great Britain. And in helping the United States take over Canada, then the United States would lay pressure on the British to free Ireland. So the whole goal is to free Ireland here in this whole episode.
Yeah, on its face, it sort of seems like a crazy scheme that they were going to hold Canada hostage. I was trying to think back to history if there's any other examples where basically a political mission was undertaken by way of holding a country hostage, and I couldn't come up with anything.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that was probably the dreams for some of the most radical Fenians here. But I think it seems to us absolutely completely absurd, in the time that we live in, where the two countries share this longest peaceable international border. But in the first 100 years of American history, the idea of invading Canada is as patriotic as fireworks on the 4th of July. I mean, even before the Declaration of Independence is signed, the first place the Continental Army goes is due north to Canada. Then, of course, during the War of 1812. And there was just such animosity towards the British in the aftermath of the Civil War, both in terms of Confederate warships being built in British ports, and also as Canada was sort of this refuge for the Confederate Secret Service that launched raids on banks in St. Albans, Vermont, and plotted the firebombing of theaters in New York, and was thought to possibly be involved in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. That all these things are wrapped up in this story at the time, that it's not as far out of the realm of possibility in terms of, there had been talk about this war between the United States and Great Britain, and then if they had their aims aligned, that something could happen here. One of the most interesting things I found in doing the research here is that during this time period, there's a bill that's introduced in the Congress that basically lays out where the 4 new states from Canada are going to be the next part of the United States, and where the 29 new representatives were going to come. And then there was a senator from Michigan who had this idea as a way to reunite the United States after the end of the Civil War, was they would put together a 200,000 man army with half the men from the North, half the men from the South. They would invade Canada, and they were going to, in essence, hold it, occupy it until the British paid reparations for the damage caused by the Confederate warships that were paid in their ports. So, I mean, it's crazy, but it's also being talked about at the highest levels of the American government too at the time.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because that's something that Canadians have no idea about, and I didn't either. So that's a cool little wrinkle of history. Just out of curiosity, where do you know offhand where those new states would come from? Like, would it be like just take Quebec and Ontario and New Brunswick and just create them into states?
I think it was, and I think maybe Nova Scotia may have been the fourth one out of those. But yeah, definitely those. I think first three were included in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, it might be a great way to reunite the country after the war. Find an external enemy. It kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting what you said about how the Fenian invasions in America, I said in Canada, we get this much room in the textbook. And in America, there's nothing because it is overshadowed by this epic event of the Civil War. For Canadian history enthusiasts, and even more specifically for Civil War buffs, we don't have a Civil War. We don't have Gettysburg or, Grant versus Lee. So the Fenians are really the only thing we've got for this time period in terms of military history. So I think that's why maybe we get a little bit more play with it up in Canada, just because it is,
Right.
all
I mean,
intents and purposes, the only thing we've got.
yeah, and it also leads right into Confederation, right? So, I mean, it's sort of, I can sort of see it akin to these episodes in the 1770s that lead up to the American Revolution. So, an event like the Boston Tea Party, okay, it's not necessarily a huge event in history, but it becomes one because it's this part of this timeline that leads to the American Revolution. So I think you have that timeline there where it's tied into Confederation. Here is completely lost between the aftermath of the Civil War and then Reconstruction. So I mean, it doesn't really fit into any of the the overarching
main
history of
narratives.
where the country's. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that echoes to today like those two events do, and it didn't ultimately change necessarily any aspects of American history like it does for Canadian history.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. With hindsight being what it is, it's really easy for us in the year 2021 to look back at the Fenian invasions of Canada and sort of shrug it off and laugh it off as well. This thing that was ultimately destined to fail. But I was just thinking about the other day, what would this look like in our current world if, let's say, 800 American veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan suddenly landed on the border of Canada and they're armed to the teeth with sophisticated weaponry? It would be no laughing matter, would it?
No, and I think that's what's important when we're talking about history also, is to try to some ways transport us back, or as you're sort of doing, trying to think of a modern day equivalent and how the reaction would be. And um, I think writing the book, just trying to put yourself in the mind of Canadians who are living right along the border, and for the course of 5 years, you have this threat of invaders coming from the south. And if we were going to put it into more modern day parlance, you would say that the Fenians who invaded Canada were radicalized by their experiences living under the British. They had seen, as I said, the British trying to take away their culture, language, and religion, and now the food crops are failing and food's still being exported to Britain, but they don't have anything to eat. They have to flee their homeland. So you see where the motivations are coming from the Fenian side, but then also trying to put yourself in that perspective of just the threat that you must have been living with at the border, just in terms of the invasions happened 5 times. There's always a threat of another invasion that's happening. How I think one of the powerful moments in and Peter probably talked about this about Ridgeway too, is there's a number of University of Toronto students who die in the Battle of Ridgeway, and to think about what would the reaction be if you had college students who were basically killed by people would nowadays maybe consider terrorists coming above
Yeah.
across the border. And it does, I think, put things in a different light of how we sort of look back at things. But I think that's the importance of history, is to try to make those connections between the the humanity of the past and our present as well.
Yeah. And you raise an interesting point about, you use the word terrorism. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look at the historical documents, the word terrorism probably isn't used, but I mean, it sure as heck would be used today if the same thing happened.
Yeah, I mean, you go to political terrorism, radicalization. Those are the words that you would be using
Right.
today to
Right.
to
So maybe we can get into Ridgeway a little bit later, but could you fill us in on the other Fenian Raids, because Ridgeway was but just one, and there was several others.
it's the first, and it's the biggest, and it's the most noteworthy. So that's in June of 1866. So the Fenian Brotherhood, as I mentioned, sort of its original goal, it's founded in the United States in 1858 by a man named John O'Mahony, who was had born, raised in Ireland, had been a member of the failed Young Ireland Rebellion in 1848. And he starts the Fenian Brotherhood in the United States. The sister organization, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded in Dublin in 1858 by James Stephens, another veteran of the Young Ireland movement. So these men are trying to keep alive the revolutionary spirit and have this next revolution in Ireland. And by 1866, when there's starting to be the split inside the Fenian Brotherhood, John O'Mahony had always wanted to stick with the original plan of having the revolution in Ireland. He can see basically his power starting to slip away. He agrees that they could do a small invasion in April of 1866 of Campobello Island, right off the coast of Maine and New Brunswick. His idea is that they could take Campobello Island and maybe use this now as a base of operations to launch an attack overseas, or to launch privateers to disrupt British sailing. It's a real half-hearted effort, and
So
it's
he's basically just sort of trying to compromise with his more radical elements.
exactly, he's just trying to do anything to keep the money flowing into his, because he is, this idea of attacking Canada by April of 1866 is definitely the idea that's in the ascendancy, and that's the more powerful wing of the organization. He sees this as maybe just one possible way he can just try to hold on to power, is to sort of give a nod to the idea of invading Canada, but not really doing it
Right.
full time. So men leave on trains from New York. They send a boat that's launched with weapons. Then O'Mahony has second thoughts, brings the boat back. So the men show up in Eastport, Maine, and have no weapons. And basically, they loiter around for a couple of weeks. They do launch a nighttime raid on one of the islands. They burn down a building that happens to be owned by an American, and take Union Jack off the custom house, bring it back to New York, and that was the full extent of it. And basically, John O'Mahony then had to resign in disgrace, and that was the end of really his real involvement with the Fenian Brotherhood, although he'll come back later. But it's this group that wants to attack Canada that's now firmly in the ascendancy. They have General Thomas William Sweeney, who develops their war plan, a 5-pronged war plan of invading Canada in June, and then from that is what ends up becoming the invasion of Ridgeway, at least the Battle of Ridgeway. One other prong of that, at the same time that there's that crossing of the Niagara River into Ontario, is a couple days after the Battle of Ridgeway, there's another group that goes in from just north of St. Albans, Vermont, a small town called Franklin, and goes into southern Quebec. And basically, the Canadian Defense Forces had pulled back about 10 miles from the border in the aftermath of Ridgeway. The whole plan here, when Thomas Sweeney developed it, was that invasion from Buffalo into Ontario, that was all going to be a feint. And his whole plan was to have like a 17,000 man army go right up through the Lake Champlain Valley. Well, the unit ends up crossing from Vermont into Quebec is about 800 men or so. But with no defense forces, they basically just have free reign over a couple towns in southern Quebec and the eastern townships for about 48 hours. And then once the Canadian Defense Forces are coming, they basically beat it right back to the American side. And that's the end of what happens in 1866. By 1870, John ONeill, who had been the general at the Battle of Ridgeway, has now become the president of the Fenian Brotherhood. And he will never let go of this idea of invading Canada. So in 1870, he launches another attack on Canada, unbelievably to me, down the same exact road from Vermont into Quebec that was done in 1866. And this road into Quebec is right underneath Eccles Hill. So unbeknownst to them, there's all these home guards, dozens of them up on Eccles Hill behind rocks, just watching this whole scene down on this dairy farm owned by a man named Albert Richard, who has now had the bad luck of twice having his farm become a battlefield. And as soon as the Fenians cross in, the home guards will open fire. And the Battle of Eccles Hills takes place on Albert Richard's farmhouse, and he is getting his farmhouse basically shot up with bullet holes. He's got armies now tramping through his house, tracking mud everywhere. But there's a couple fatalities on the Fenian side, and the battle only lasts a few hours. And John ONeill suffers the ultimate indignity of actually being arrested on the battlefield by a United States Marshal. This is on the Vermont side. So it's a complete fiasco. The next day, there'll be another incursion from northern New York into southern Quebec. So from outside Malone, New York, the Fenians cross in a few hundred yards into Canadian territory. The next morning, there's another shootout in what's called the Battle of Trout River. But the arrival of the Canadian Defense Forces basically pushed the Fenians back into American territory. So this whole 1870 invasion it's a complete and utter disaster. And John ONeill is arrested. He stands trial, and he is ultimately put in prison in Vermont for his role in doing this. Because a private citizen is conducting war against a country with the United States as at peace is a violation of federal law. So that's where the legal aspect of all this comes into. John ONeill gets a pardon from President Ulysses S. Grant under the condition that he will never again invade Canada. And he freely agrees to this.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he actually believed it or not. I don't think he did. But by October of 1871, he's back at it again. And this time the Fenian Brotherhood he's no longer the president. The Fenian Brotherhood wants nothing to do with his plan of invading Canada again. So he sort of goes rogue. And he gets a group of about 36 Irishmen from Minnesota, and he launches an invasion from North Dakota into Manitoba. And the whole idea is he aligns himself with another Irishman who had a former alliance with the Métis population there. So again, the expectation that they're having is, all right, as soon as we get into Manitoba, we're going to get all the support of Louis Riel and the Métis. And of course, again, does not happen. And the most farcical moment of the book is that, so John ONeill and the Fenians cross into across the border. They take a Canadian Customs house. They take a house owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. And then after a few hours, all of a sudden they see United States cavalry coming to them, and the cavalry places all of them under arrest. And John ONeill cannot understand how cavalry was able to cross into the Canadian border. Well, unbeknownst to John ONeill, he had seen a map that showed that the Custom House and Hudson's Bay Company was a quarter mile north of the border. What he didn't know is that the border had been resurveyed in the interim, and now the territory he was in was actually 3/4 of a mile south of where the border actually was. So John ONeill never actually invaded Canada, because technically he never left American soil. and that's why he was able to be arrested. So that was sort of the ignominious end for the Fenian Raids. And John ONeill will then go on to start these colonies of Irish Americans out in Nebraska. And I'm fully convinced that he was probably using that as a place away from prying eyes to actually try something again at some point. But then he ends up passing away. I think it's 1876 before he can. But I don't think he ever let go of this idea of invading Canada.
Yeah, it sounds like he was a true revolutionary at heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
The kind of guy who, in the current era, he'd have the NSA and CSIS all over him, tracking his movements.
Yep. And I think it's important to note his background too. So he's a descendant of great Irish revolutionaries like Hugh O'Neill and Owen Roe O'Neill, who stood up to Queen Elizabeth I, fought British forces. And this is sort of the underlying thing with everything in the book is John ONeill knows that the odds are long against him, but the odds are always long against the Irish and anything that they had tried against the British. But he also knew that just by fighting the British, you would become a hero in Irish eyes. So success was not necessarily a determinant of whether you were remembered in Irish history. It was that you dared to fight the British. And this sort of underlies, I think, a lot of the Fenian attitude here is that the odds are definitely going to be long for them to succeed in any venture here in Canada. But they figured they just need to be successful at some point in the 700-year history, and that if they can keep at least the revolutionary spirit alive, it could pass down to another generation that might ultimately be successful. And that's what's going to happen. I mean, they keep that revolutionary torch from the Young Ireland group of 1848. They pass it along to the 1916 generation that's ultimately successful with the Easter Rising, in part because of the money and weapons that are sent to them from Irish nationalists in the United States.
Right. So even though the Fenians weren't successful in Canada, it's the infrastructure that they built up with sending money back home to Ireland would ultimately pay off.
Yeah. So when they form in 1858, it's really this first transatlantic revolutionary organization that's ever been founded. So this is a different model where they're going to try to put the army together in Ireland, and they're going to try to fund it and arm it from the United States. At a point now where transatlantic crossings are at least matters of days and not weeks, so it's a little bit more possible for that to be done. And then once you finally have transatlantic cables and communication going on, that speeds up and makes this transatlantic revolutionary organization much more effective by the time of 1916.
Yeah. So far with John ONeill and the Fenians, we've got like 3, 4, maybe 5 debacles. Then we've got Ridgeway though, where they actually pull it off and they score a goal. They get a victory at Ridgeway.
Yeah.
First of all, it's really interesting to me how you have this force of, let's say, 800, 1,000 men, and they're composed of veterans from both the northern side of the Civil War and the southern side. Seems really, really interesting, or even odd, that they would be able to work together mere months after the Civil War. I mean, there's probably a good chance that some of these guys were on the field of battle shooting against each other in the previous years. And yet they come together. That's interesting to me.
Yeah. And it was to me as well. And you have actually some of these men still wearing their uniforms from the Civil War as well. And I never came across anything that said that there were high tensions among those who were fighting at Ridgeway because of the different sides they were on. And I think partly it's because of they sort of had more of the common Irish experience in the Civil War. So for the Irish, as I said, a scholar named Damien Shields has done a lot of research on this, and he estimates about 200,000 Irish fight in the Civil War, about 180,000 for the Union, 20,000 for the Confederacy. And where you were fighting, the side you were fighting on really was just a matter of geography. It was basically which port did you come into when you fled Ireland to come to the United States. So most of those Irish who were fighting in the Confederacy, they settled in New Orleans or Mobile, those sort of port cities. And the Irish who are enlisting really aren't doing it over slavery. And certainly for the Irish who are fighting for the Union, um, they're not that interested in emancipation because it just means more competition for jobs they don't necessarily have. They're enlisting mainly because they need a paycheck. They're still at the bottom rung of the economic ladder, and that's why they're joining in so many numbers. So you have, when the Civil War starts, most men who enlisted didn't expect the war to last a year, let alone 4 years. They figured, all right, I'll sign up 3 months. I get a paycheck. There's a chance I might get killed, but we don't really expect this to be much of a war. And then, of course, the war becomes a lot more prolonged and deadly than anyone thought it would. And it's going to be the Irish who are dying in tremendous numbers certainly in the first 2 years of the war.
Right.
So there are stories of actually during the war in winter camps in Virginia that the Fenian Brotherhood recruiter came one night to where the Army of the Potomac was. The Irishmen from the Army of Potomac went out into the woods to have a meeting with this Fenian recruiter, and then from the other side came Irish from the Confederate forces, basically just laid down their arms, heard about what was going on with the war that they really wanted to fight, which was going to be one that liberated Canada. So a lot of the diehard Fenians who enlisted thought that the Civil War would be a training ground for that war that they really wanted to fight. So they'd learn weaponry tactics, they'd learn battlefield strategies, and then take that knowledge. So in essence, yeah, you've got men who are fighting on both sides here, but they have oddly sort of this common purpose where they're just seeing this as training for the
The
battle of
larger, the
Ridgeway
larger.
in a way. That invasion is the one that they want to fight.
Yeah. So nothing personal. In
Yeah,
this thing.
no, no.
You can imagine though. I mean, the soldier campfires with John O'Neill and Ridgeway, like having men on both sides. I mean, there must have been some chirping and some back and forth about the various battles and sides of the war. But yeah, it's interesting how they were able to set that rivalry aside and sort of
Mhm.
just pursue the bigger picture, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
these were guys who knew how to fight.
oh yeah.
Yeah, like the veterans. One of the interesting things about Ridgeway is that you do have these veterans of the war, and when they come up across the Canadian militia, it's not surprising that they get a win on this one.
Yeah, I mean, even though they are outnumbered, I mean, they've got a lot of them have battle experience. So they're used to just even the sounds of gunfire and bullets sort of whizzing by and just the whole battlefield experience, which is something that was not, for the men on the other side, men and boys on the other side, did not have that experience. And so because, they were outnumbered, but that advantage that they had in the experience, I think probably is the decisive, factor here when it comes to them ending up
Yeah,
winning
for sure.
that
One thing
battle.
that Peter mentioned in his discussion with me is that, and I don't think there's any proof of this, but it's mere speculation that he was saying that he thought that the Fenians were sort of pulling their shots in the battle because they routed the Canadian forces. And though the casualties were heavy by Canadian standards, by Civil War standards, they weren't, that great. So he was sort of theorizing that the Fenians were sort of going easy on the Canadians a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, and then the narrative of the battle is that the Fenians were sort of getting pushed back in the early parts of the battle. Just they didn't have the same weaponry necessarily, and but they were able to fall back and then all of a sudden make this charge that completely turns the tide of the battle. Um, but they were definitely able to do things with an experienced force that they knew the Canadians were not going to be able to do in there. So
Yeah, and just the
yeah, I mean, I can
psychological
definitely
edge
see that
alone
being,
too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, having, and I think it's what you get when you start getting these accounts. Then, particularly when you get them from like the university students, you know, who once the tide of the battle turns, and then they're retreating, and then you know they just describe seeing one of their friends basically getting shot on the battlefield and just dropping right there, and just the psychological shock of that, experiencing that for the first time, whereas you know 4 years of civil war, you know, the United States had basically seen it all, even if you weren't fighting. And there were some Fenians there who, you know, weren't Civil War veterans, but the whole country had seen the photographs and read about the horror and lived war for 4 years. I mean, that was part of the American psyche at that point, and would be carried among the Fenians.
Yeah. Every armchair historian in general likes to ask like the what if questions. Do you think the Fenians could have pulled this off? Like, was there any chance, or was this destined to fail right from the beginning?
I think it was destined to fail from the beginning. I mean, they made a lot of assumptions that, again, sort of fall in the line of American military history, but the underlying assumption is that once they cross into Canada, they're going to get the support of all the Irish Canadians. They're going to get the support of the French-speaking population in Quebec, and you know when the Fenians invade, you know for the Battle Ridge, they cross with their weapons. They're not crossing with any commissary. They don't have any food or supplies. They just expect that they're going to get friendly people on the other side of the border who are going to supply them with everything that they need. Um, so very big assumptions that were baked into this war plan, that they're going to get a lot of native support for what they're going to do. They're going to be greeted as liberators, rather than invaders. This sort of age old trope in American military history. So, I mean, that was just a real inflated assumption. And then they overestimated what support they're going to get among the Irish Americans in the United States too. The plan starts to fall apart really, even before it starts, even before the Battle of Ridgeway, because as I mentioned, Sweeney has this 5-pronged invasion that he's planning. Well, they get to Detroit and they can't find any boats. Chicago, they don't have any of the men. The commander doesn't show up in Cleveland. So Sweeney basically is improvising and sends everyone that he can find into Buffalo just to get across the border, because he figures once he shows everyone that they're serious about invading Canada, then they're going to get tens of thousands of Fenians coming from behind them. And a lot do show up in Buffalo, but the United States government cuts them off. I mean, that's maybe the one big what if moment, is what if the United States government didn't intervene and let all these Fenians that were gathering in Buffalo in the days after Ridgeway into Ontario? How different would that have looked? Um,
Yeah,
but
because it
still,
seems like they were sort of, in some ways, the American authorities were turning a blind eye.
oh, they totally were, because they weren't against again. I mean, America's sort of casting its eyes north for some territory, so they're not uh, adverse to the Fenians for that purpose, and also for trying to pressure the British to pay up these millions of dollars in reparations that they're looking. So the Johnson administration definitely sort of giving its tacit nod for them to get in there, but after a few days, they've got to keep some semblance of American law, and they will cut the supply lines. So really I think the only realistic option that the Fenians really have here was to do something that was going to spark the American government getting in and backing them. I mean, I think that's really the only realistic odds that they would have to actually gaining their true goal of Irish independence out of this whole
Yeah,
Fenian
yeah,
raid.
maybe like do a raid in Canada and hope that the British follow you back onto the other side of the border, provoke an incident.
That, and also, so there's a possibility in the aftermath of Ridgeway also, because you have a few dozen Fenians who were captured, who are then court-martialed in Toronto and I think in Montreal as well. And they were then going to be executed, and including one Catholic priest. And it's the British who start really laying the pressure, diplomatic pressure, then on the Canadian authorities to not do this, do not make martyrs out of these men. And if they did, then maybe that changes it too, and that sparks, because the American government is very insistent also that these men should not be executed; they should come back to America. It's a lesson that, ironically, the British do not learn from in 1916, because they go ahead and they execute the leaders of the Easter Rising, create the martyrs in that situation, and which plays a huge role into the eventual war for independence. So it's a lesson that the British do not learn from the Fenian Raids.
Yeah, yeah, really good point. And it flies in the face of how we treat terrorists today. You get charged with terrorism on either side of the border, and you're going away for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, there's also this interesting story that's tied into this too, about the whole concept of citizenship. So this will come into play that a lot of Americans will then, as I mentioned, the original idea is to have this invasion, a revolution in Ireland. There is still a group of hardcores who stick to that plan, and then Americans who then participate in a failed uprising in Ireland in 1867, where again the British arrest them. But in British eyes, these men, because they were born in Ireland, which was British territory at the time, are forever British, cannot renounce citizenship. And it becomes a big diplomatic row between the United States and Great Britain. And basically, this whole concept of being able to renounce your citizenship gets established into international law after that. So this is sort of an undercurrent that's in all these diplomatic negotiations too, about, are the Fenians actually British citizens or are they American citizens?
Right. Yeah. What happened to those guys? Were they executed?
They were not.
Okay.
No. So they did stand court martial, but the American diplomatic pressure, they did. So no executions really come of the Fenian Raids.
Right. There's a statue dedicated to Ridgeway behind Queen's Park, which is the legislative buildings in Ontario. And I went to school at University of Toronto for a while, so my path would take me through the Queen's Park grounds. And tucked away behind this like overgrown shrubbery and trees is this big monument to Ridgeway. And the thing is totally like just fallen into disrepair. Like it's weathered. The face on the statues are almost unrecognizable. There's limbs of the statues that have like fallen off and just decayed over time. So total state of disrepair. And the ironic part is that, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but there's an inscription barely legible that something along the lines of "These men will not be forgotten," and they 100% have been forgotten. Is there any monuments on the American side to this historical event?
There are a few historical markers that have been placed in. There's one in Vermont it's actually like 10 miles south of the border, so it's not actually anywhere near where the Battle of Eccles Hill occurred in 1870. It's more along the most trafficked highway they could find that comes near the border. There's a historic marker that's actually just recently been erected in upstate New York, north of Malone, to commemorate that Battle of Trout River in 1870. I think it's just been erected in the last year or two. So there are some of those historical markers, but there is nothing akin to that here, where statues have been erected to the Fenian leaders. In a way, it's been the Fenian markers really became the grave sites of these men, and I think ties into maybe Irish tradition as well. So the gravestone for John ONeill, who was buried in Omaha, Nebraska, would sort of be a place that you would lay a wreath at to commemorate, the Fenian invasions. And I closed the book with Eamon de Valera, who's really the foremost Irish Republican in the 20th century, one of the key revolutionary figures, along with Michael Collins. I end the book with him laying a wreath on the grave of John ONeill, and was sort of seen as a part of a pilgrimage for him to make. And he does it to sort of acknowledge, as I had talked about before, sort of this connection between the Fenian Brotherhood and his generation that's trying to cast off the British rule in Ireland. And that's pretty, I mean, you have in a lot of the, some of the Fenian leaders, their bodies are actually brought back to Ireland. They're buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in this one plot of land that is, in a way, it's an amazing plot of history, with all these great Irish revolutionaries buried in such close proximity. So it really became the graves of some of these men in the cities around New England and New York. Calvary Cemetery in Queens, New York, is a big site. So those would be the places that the Fenians would maybe gather to try to pay honor and remember the men who carried out the invasions.
Right. The book is called When the Irish Invaded Canada. Christopher Klein. I think we'll end it off there. So I just want to say, first of all, that I feel like we just sort of scratched the surface of this topic like we always do on this show. Thanks a lot for joining.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Russell.
And that concludes my discussion with Christopher Klein, author of When the Irish Invaded Canada. Like I said earlier, I'm going to post a link to that book on the website for you to check out. I think one of the big takeaways from the Fenian invasions is that it's incredibly easy to look back at the failures of history and conclude that they weren't important and they were destined to fail and end that way. But put yourself there. Imagine how you would react. Imagine how your neighbors, your town, your city would react. Imagine the panic and uncertainty if the Fenian invasions happened, or if another invasion happened in your country presently. It becomes a lot more real. It becomes a lot harder to laugh at, or shrug off, or say it's not important. Okay. If you like the episode and you like what we're doing here, by the way, apologies for the hiatus on new episodes. But if you like what we're doing here, help me out by subscribing or following to the channel. I want to do a shout out to Elijah Collins, Wilhelm5831, Logan Fisher for subscribing to the channel. Gentlemen, thank you for your support. Finally, I'm going to end this off by dedicating the episode to the veterans of the Fenian invasions on both sides of the conflict. And I think that's going to be it for today. That's it. That's all. Hopefully see you next time.